Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining the award ceremony of Borderless, the Inter-College Econometric Digital Competition, organized jointly by King's College London and the University of Queensland. I'm Elisa Cavatorta, and I've led the King's College side of this collaboration, and I'm joined by Carl Sherwood and Diane and Ellie Price, who work on the organization of this event from the University of Queensland side. So the goal of this joint initiative is to develop leadership and employability skills and teamwork skills, literally teamwork across the globe, by creating this new cross-border opportunity where students from two universities work together toward a concrete common project on a topic of contemporary importance. So this year's topic was public health, and the participant task was to argue for or against one statement. The statement was the differences between countries' performances in handling the COVID-19 pandemic are best explained by a country's characteristics before the pandemic, rather than by a country's responses to the pandemic. So it's a very great pleasure for me and my colleagues at the University of Queensland to welcome you all to the award ceremony and to celebrate together this fantastic work of all the students participating. The initiative was made possible by the effort and contribution of many people who I'd like to thank. So first of all, I would like to thank the judges, some of which are here today. From the University of Queensland side, we have Dr. Anari Deval, Dr. Fu Ouyang, and Dr. Suzanne Bonner. And from the King's College side, we have Dr. Alberto Vesperoni, Dr. Kalibash Kuralbayeva, and Professor Jonathan Portes. So thank you all for the invaluable input in assessing the submissions. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank Ellie Price and Dan Mansfield, who have helped with the competition related website and part of the communications. The initiative would not have been possible without the joint financial contribution of the School of Economics at the University of Queensland and a grant from the Faculty of Social Sciences and Public Policy Educational Fund at King's College London. So I would like to thank also my colleagues, Daniel Sizzo, the Dean and Head of School of Economics at UQ, and Andrew Blick, the Head of the Department of Political Economy, who both supported the initiative from its inception. Andrew is here today, and he will award the first prize in the competition. So thank you for joining. Finally, but not least, a really big thank you goes to my colleague at UQ, Carl Sherwood, and Diane Su, who since the very early discussion about the competition, they have done tremendous work, who actually made this possible to implement successfully the competition. So a big thank Carl and Diane. And now, well, so without further ado, let us move to the moment you're all waiting for, the awards announcements. So let me say that all the judges in all the judging panel was absolutely impressed by all the videos. They all told me how enjoyable and insightful the videos were, and it was sometimes quite hard to make a selection. This year there were 5 assessment criteria, each of which carried 20 points, and the final score for each submission was the average across the assessment of the 6 judges. And up to yesterday afternoon, the videos, which are uploaded since only 2 weeks, received over 360 views on YouTube altogether. So very well done to all of you. This is absolutely great. So let me start with some honorable mentions for 2 teams who made it very, very close to the podium. So the first honorable mention goes to team number 3, made by Adam, Vedant, Dixin, and Gao. So a round of applause for them. So I have here one of the comment from the judging panel. One of them said the presentation was very well explained and engaging. It was easy to follow the logical flow of the argument, and it was very pleasant to listen. So congratulations. Now, the second honorable mention goes to team number 13, made by Zacharias, Erona, Yunkin, and Oscar. Congratulations. So here I have another comment from the judging panel who said, I found this presentation extremely engaging. Kudos for the acting skills. So very well done, Zakaria, Erona, Yunkin, and Oscar. And now, let's go to the moment you're all waiting for, the podium. So I let Carl from Queensland to reveal the team who is awarded the third prize. Carl, can you break the news?
Thanks, Eliza, and thanks for all those nice words in the introduction. So it's my pleasure to announce the third place prize winner, which goes to team number 1, made up of Alexandra, Nicholas, James, and Georgia. So well done, great effort. Yep. Well done. So I have some comments from the judges that they would like to pass on. I'm not sure, Eliza, if some of the judges there would like directly to make a comment. Did you want to do that?
Maybe go on, Carla. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll read out the comments that I have just very briefly. One of the judges particularly liked the graphical representation, so that was well done. Another judge was particularly interested in the conclusions about the different responses or capacities between the low and high income countries. One judge, just for some constructive feedback, was suggesting that less text and a sharper argument might have just helped get this one up a little further in the rankings, but overall they thought the structure was very clear, and so was the presentation. My comments were also on the positive side. I particularly liked how it was fairly concise, and I know 5 minutes is pretty short, but I thought you concisely analysed the data to present a very clear evidence-based argument and conclusions. So overall, well done.
Yeah, congratulations, congratulations.
So yeah, well done, guys.
And now let's go to the second place. Professor Jonathan Portens will announce the second place. Jonathan, can you give us the news?
Okay, so the prize for second place goes to the team composed of Ian, Juan Pedro, Yingxi, and Xing Hao. So
fantastic.
I thought this was a really clear and quite rigorous presentation of a relatively simple model, and I quite like that. There wasn't an attempt to over elaborate it, given the limitations of the data and the but it was a good explanation of this simple model with a detailed and pretty rigorous acknowledgement of the reverse causality problem. And I think, the fundamental challenge faced by any attempt to do this sort of cross-country comparison using econometric analysis is obviously reverse causality, or endogeneity, or however you want to think about it. The problem that obviously the measures taken by countries to combat the pandemic both cause and are caused by, in an econometric sense, the severity of the pandemic. So how do you allow for that? And I won't say that this presentation solved that problem any more than the many thousands of papers on this topic have, but I thought it did explain the nature of the problem, and therefore what you could conclude from the modeling very well indeed, and I thought a well-merited second place. And finally, just to say that I enjoyed watching all of the videos, and thanks to Elisa and Carl for giving us the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And finally, here we are there. So we are going to announce the first prize. Andrew, would you be able to reveal us which team is the winning team of this year's Borderless competition?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. It's team number 8.
Team number 8 made of?
Made of Guan Allen, Yihan, Abby and Lachlan. It's had, I think, 101 views, or maybe more by now. It got a score of 78.66, all very impressive stuff. And there's some really good feedback on it. One says that an excellent, very clear and engaging presentation of a rigorous analysis. Another judge has said particularly good was the acknowledgement of the endogeneity of policy response to the intensity of the pandemic. And a third bit of feedback really liked the way that the video was structured. They liked the visuals complemented with detailed explanations. So really, I can just say very well done. Thanks to Lisa and to everyone for organising this, and congratulations to both to the winner and everyone else who took part on your work.
So a big round of applause. Okay, so now I suggest that we will watch together the video of the winning team, and we will join in right after for another big round of applause to everyone. So let me show you the video.
Coronavirus is an infectious disease that primarily spreads through carrier saliva droplets. Since the first confirmed case on January 10, 2020, there have been over 100 million confirmed cases worldwide. This video compares countries' pre-pandemic characteristics and their responses to find out which provides a more comprehensive explanation for the performance difference between countries in combating COVID-19. We have chosen the OECD countries as our sample because of their data's credibility and completeness. The country's performance depends on how well they control the spread and treat the infected, measured by the total cases, cases relative to population, and the mortality rate. We found the performance index calculated by the Lowy Institution to best encompass these factors and give a comprehensive measure of the country's performance in combating COVID-19. This index tracks these 6 measures and generates a normalized average of the rankings of the measurements, ranging from 0 to 100. Now we move on to the pre-pandemic characteristic indicators. Our characteristic index consists of the 5 following indicators. Total population influences the base of infection and higher population density, which increases transmission. We also include GDP per capita and hospital beds per 1,000 people as an indicator of healthcare capacity and access to personal protective equipment. Lastly, a geographical characteristic, distance from the closest early epicenter. We determined the largest early epicenter to be the following countries and measured our sample countries' distance from each of these epicenters, accounting for a variation in performance due to proximity to early containment hazards before travel bans were out in place. To generate a characteristic index, we ranked each country by these indicators and then took an equally weighted average of these rankings. Take Australia, for example. It is ranked 22nd in lowest total population among our samples, 1st in lowest population density, 7th in highest GDP per capita, 19th in the most hospital beds per 1,000 people, and 3rd in furthest away from epicenter. Therefore, its characteristic index is 10.4. Now for the response index, we evaluate the country's response since the local outbreak, which according to WHO is defined as the date when the locally confirmed cases reach 100. We consider the country's timeliness to respond to the local outbreak via implementation of lockdown and comprehensive contact tracing, the duration of lockdown within 100 days since the outbreak, and its effort to distribute COVID-19 tests, and using the same method to create a second index. As government may only put in place responses to address changes in performance, a core issue associated with responses is reverse causality, whereby the dependent variable actually impacts the independent variable. We have tried to reduce its potential source of bias by using initial proactive measures of response and measuring responses at the time when countries are experiencing similar performances. To analyze the relationship between characteristics and response against performance, we have modeled our indexes graphically and further our analysis via linear regression analysis. Through the analysis, we have calculated the coefficient correlation R value and the coefficient of determination R square value for the relationship between the index. For both of the models, the x-axis represents the response and characteristic index for the respective graphs, and the y-axis represents the Lowy performance index. For the analysis between characteristic and performance, the regression analysis suggests that there is a moderately strong negative association between the characteristic index and the performance index. This relationship has an R value of negative 0.8, which implies that the index is correlated negatively, whereas the characteristic index increases, and thus the characteristic becomes less favorable, the performance index will decrease. Furthermore, the strength of this relationship can be described through the calculated R-square value of 0.65. This indicates that approximately 65% of the variation of countries' performance level can be explained by the variation of their characteristics. In comparison, the analysis for responses against performance yielded a much smaller association. As seen through the graph and through the R value of 0.28, it implies that the response and the performance are positively correlated. This suggests that as the response of a country becomes less favorable, the country's performance increases. Furthermore, the calculated R-square value is 0.08, which suggests that only 8% of the performance variation can be explained by the response. There are certain limitations within our model. Firstly, as some of our samples were early epicenter themselves, they cannot be ranked in this characteristic, leading to some inconsistency in calculating average ranking score. Secondly, the issue of reverse causality still creates some bias even if we try to focus on proactive measures, as response is inherently determined by the country's performance to some extent. With all that being said, we conclude that the country's characteristics are better explaining difference in country's performance than country's response to the pandemic.
Great. So I would like to invite all of you to join me for a round of applause for the winning teams and all the participating teams. So all the videos will be up on a webpage hosted at both universities, and I would like to invite you all to share them and inspire others to learn, to engage with econometrics and scientific research. So many thanks to all of you for attending the ceremony today. And after we say goodbye, instead of closing the meeting, I'm going to showcase one after the next, the other two finalist videos in full, followed by some credit for everybody involved in the competition. So if you would like to stay online and watch, stay in and enjoy the screenings. Otherwise, stay safe, and I hope to see one of your friends doing the same competition next year. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
This video mainly explains the relationship between the dependent variables COVID-19 death per million and the 6 variables we chose as follow. To determine whether the differences in the performance of countries in the COVID-19 pandemic, depends on the characteristic of the country before the pandemic or the response of country after the pandemic. At first, according to our daily news and some experiences in our own countries, we agreed that differences in the performance of country should be reflected in the country's response to the pandemic. But by analyzing the 5 basic variables, over 65-years-old population ratio, Gini, GDP per capita, urban population, and opposite rate, we found that the characteristic of country before the pandemic do indeed play a decisive role in the differences in the performance of countries. What's more, through our analysis of various countries' government decisions during the pandemic, here we choose GRI, Government Response Index, to explain. It covers 14 factors, and we got a very interesting conclusion. The specific analysis process will be explained by my teammate Ian and Xinhao, and GP will summarize our analysis.
We will now discuss the results for the GRI regression. We can see that when we increase mean GRI by 1 unit, the number of deaths per 100,000 people should increase by about 2.2. This is statistically significant at the 5% level. This positive coefficient is confusing, as it suggests that the stricter the government responses to COVID, the greater the number of deaths by COVID. However, this can be easily explained as a problem of reverse causality. Instead of GRI increasing the number of deaths, it is more likely that the more deaths there are in the country, the stricter the government response will be. Furthermore, when testing the heteroskedasticity in functional forms, we find that the model is imprecise and that our coefficient is indeed in the proper functional form. For these reasons, coupled with low R-squared of 0.14, these regression results will be deemed inconclusive. One way in which we could improve the model to better understand the causal effect of GRI on the number of deaths is to build a more complex model with time series instead of cross-sectional data.
Our data has more than 100 countries in which include a government response index and 5 pre-pandemic variables. We can see that our variables can explain more than 50% variation in death rate. Especially, the government response index and above 65 and obesity rate have a significant impact on the death rate. The coefficient of government response index decreased after adding more pre-outbreak variables into models, but is still in a significant way. Not surprisingly, the above 65 are significant due to the characteristic of COVID-19. It is more fatal to the elder people. Moreover, the obesity rate may suggest the lifestyle of residents or how people lay stress on health. So we choose Model 3 as our optimal model.
In summary, our analysis was inconclusive since we weren't able to quantify how important a government's response to the pandemic is when compared to pre-pandemic factors, mainly due to the reverse causality in the GRI. Ideally, we should have created a model where the GRI variable is weighted more towards earlier restrictions, as those are the ones which matter most according to the literature, and it would be a way to not have the reverse causality problem, to overcome it, instead of just using the mean GRI over the whole pandemic period. Regarding our other independent variables, we found that, unsurprisingly, what confused most how badly a pandemic hit the country in terms of deaths is the amount of elderly people in it. Obesity rates were also very significant, while other variables, mostly economic variables, are very minor or insignificant. For future analysis, it might be interesting to include a variable which relates to cultural characteristics of a country, such as a country's social connectedness, that is, how many people a person interacts with daily. See Milani 2021 as an example of this. Another problem with our analysis is that our choice of dependent variable may also be questionable. This is illustrated by a model where we regress the same independent variables but on COVID cases per million instead of deaths per million, and the amount of elderly and the obesity rates were still the best predictors of this, and this doesn't make sense as these variables should only predict the amount of deaths. This leads us to believe that there is a very significant amount of underreporting of both COVID cases and deaths. This underreporting has been explored in literature. See Bateman et al. 2020.
This research project will concentrate on the question whether the differences between countries' performances in handling the COVID-19 pandemic are best explained by countries' characteristics before the pandemic, rather than the countries' responses to the pandemic or reverse. To analyze it, we will use various econometrics tools, such as regression, residual plot model, and residual normal QQ plot model, and the data from our sources, such as Our World in Data, Bloomberg, and Johns Hopkins University, to evaluate the country's performances.
The performances of countries came from the Bloomberg Resilience Score, which we found through our research. That resilience score ranks the largest 53 economies on their success at containing the virus with the least amount of social and economic disruption. They considered many data sets, indicators, and indexes produced by organizations around the world. When eliminating the list of components that make up the ranking, 3 sound fundamental criteria were applied: how complete the data is, how current the data is, and how the data is collected. This resilience score only ranks economies valued at more than 200 billion prior to the pandemic. As you can see here on the bottom left, the Bloomberg Resilience Score considers the following variables as measurement of performances. Since the data we used to evaluate the performance scores is on different scales, we found it to be sensible to first normalize the data into a common scale. Like this, the relative distances between the values are maintained. We then converted the data into numbers ranging from 0 to 100 using the max-min method. Equal weights were put on the variables to obtain the final performance score of each country. So let's look at the results. Now, looking at the best and worst performing countries with a Bloomberg Resilience Score. The data on the left may imply that more developed countries performed better.
Countries' characteristics before the pandemic were represented by the following variables. Countries' responses to the pandemic were represented by Oxford's Government Response Index, as calculated by Hale et al. A higher score on this measure indicates a stricter government response to the pandemic. It's a composite measure calculated on 20 metrics.
The government responses vary due to the severity of the pandemic varied during different times. Therefore, the average of the government response index through the entire year of 2020 was calculated. Then a linear regression was performed by treating the performance score as the response variable. The variables included in the characteristics of a country and government response index were the explanatory variables to evaluate the connection between the performances and the characteristics and responses. Interaction time between Human Development Index and the Government Response Index is added to observe the interrelationship between the degree of development and the response of the government. The result of a regression model is on the right-hand side. Now, it was still necessary to check the residual plot to ensure there was no autocorrelation between residuals. The graph is here. As it can be observed, no apparent pattern was exhibited in the residuals plot. Homoscedasticity in the residuals was roughly fulfilled. Then normal quantile plot will be needed to assess the normality of the residuals. Here's our result. Again, the plot was roughly a straight line with very little deviation from the theoretical quantiles. Normality of the residuals was assured. Now we're looking at the top 10 best performing countries with their HDI and the average government response index, and the top 10 worst performing countries with their HDI and average government response index. Looking at the plot on the left-hand side, it could be observed that highly developed countries could do better even with less strict government response. This could be true in one sense. The higher level of welfare and hospital care in highly developed countries would make it easier to fight against the virus. But the government response of those countries wouldn't be a good guidance. Hence, a less strict government response would suffice in fighting against the virus.
Ultimately, the performance of the countries in handling the COVID-19 pandemic were not dependent on the country's characteristics before the pandemic or the country's responses to the pandemic alone. Rather, the combination of both the characteristics and responses have played a major role in the country's performance. However, it is also observed that countries with a high Human Development Index could use a less strict government response in handling the pandemic, while countries with a low Human Development Index must impose strict government response in order to control the pandemic.